Welcome, and thank you for finding your way here. This is a quiet space, one made for soft voices and overlooked stories. So much of history has been told by men, about men. But here, I offer something different. Stories of women, narrated by a woman, told slowly, gently, to help you drift to sleep. Research shows many people fall asleep more easily to a soothing female voice, perhaps because it echoes early comfort. My hope is to bring you long, factual stories centered on women's history, nature, and the deeply feminine, not just to inform, but to settle your mind. If you'd like to join on these quiet journeys, I'd love to have you subscribe. And please share with me any topics you'd most like me to explore. Whether you sleep through every word or stay with me until the end, let's start to get relaxed. Turn on your fan, put on your eye mask, settle into your favorite weighted blanket, and close your eyes. Let's begin by taking 2 long, deep breaths and then sigh them out. We will start to switch your brain into a more relaxed state. Clear your mind and just listen to my words. Please enjoy this telling. Now, let us begin to explore the word and meaning of matriarchy. It's a word that hums in the background of history, rarely shouted, often misunderstood, and almost never given center stage. While patriarchy has been the default lens through which many societies have been viewed, studied, debated, critiqued, its quieter counterpart tends to live in the margins, tucked into family lines, oral traditions, or tucked away in anthropology texts most people never read. But what if we took a moment to pull it gently into the light? The word itself has weight. Matriarchy conjures images for some of women ruling with iron fists. But it doesn't have to mean the opposite of patriarchy, just with the genders flipped and the crown on a woman's head. What if it means something else entirely? In many conversations, matriarchy gets boxed into binary terms, as if power must be either seized or surrendered, either patriarchal or matriarchal. But what if there's another way to understand leadership, influence, and continuity? One not defined by dominance, but by steadiness. One that doesn't require an iron fist at the top of a hierarchy, but that radiates outward in circles of care, memory, and wisdom. According to Merriam-Webster, matriarchy can mean a few things. It might refer to a family, group, or society governed by a woman or group of women, or more broadly, a social system in which women, especially mothers, hold primary power in roles of leadership, moral authority, and cultural continuity. Sometimes that looks like property passing through the mother's line. Sometimes it's decisions made by the firelight instead of behind a podium. It can be written into laws or simply lived out through the way meals are prepared, children are named, or stories are passed down in a grandmother's voice. Not always loud, not always official, but powerful nonetheless. This isn't a call to tear down the house and rebuild it in a different image. It's more like opening a window and letting some fresh questions in. In this story, we're going to wander through what matriarchy has meant at home, in culture, in leadership, not just through time, but across it. Not just in opposition to patriarchy, but as something that may have its own shape entirely. This isn't a manifesto. It's a meditation on the ways women have led, guided, and governed throughout history and into the present, on the roles they've played in homes, laws, and kingdoms, and on the possibility that power, when reimagined, might not look like someone climbing to the top at all. It might look like someone holding things together from the center. Everyday matriarchy includes the hearth as a power center. Not all forms of leadership require a title. Some take root in everyday patterns, in the rhythm of morning chores, the scent of familiar meals, the small but sacred tasks that keep life stitched together. Across centuries and cultures, women have often served as the heartbeat of the household, setting the tempo and tending to the flame, both literal and figurative. Long before anyone spoke of emotional labor, women were performing it. They were the ones noticing moods shift around the dinner table, smoothing over tension with a look or a well-timed anecdote. They remembered who hated mushrooms, who was allergic to bees, who hadn't spoken to their brother since the wedding, and why. They managed dynamics, brokered peace, and kept emotional accounts balanced without ever being formally appointed to the role. In traditional Japanese households, for example, the okasan, mother, wasn't just a caregiver. She was the quiet engine of the family, organizing meals, teaching values, maintaining social ties, and keeping traditions alive. Similarly, in rural India, the mother-in-law has long been both a matriarchal figure and a cultural memory keeper, guiding younger women in managing extended families and rituals that stretch back generations. In southern Italy, it's often said that while men may be the head of the family, women are the neck that turns the head. The Nona grandmother is revered not simply for her age, but for her wisdom, patience, and influence. She knows the family tree down to its crooked roots and can recite who married who stormed off in 1762, and which sauce recipe must be followed exactly or else. This form of leadership isn't symbolic, it's functional, and it spans continents. In many African and African diasporic families, the grandmother figure has long been both anchor and strategist. During times of migration, colonization, or systemic upheaval, it was often grandmothers and aunties who held the line. They raised children across generations, made do with little, and ensured traditions weren't lost in the shuffle. Their homes were often sanctuaries of order in a chaotic world, spaces where rules were made and enforced, and where children learned not just how to behave, but how to belong. Among the indigenous Navajo people, women traditionally owned the land and the livestock. Homes were passed from mother to daughter. And while men might have traveled or traded, the daily decisions of domestic life, the ones that shaped identity, were rooted in women's hands. The hearth wasn't a backdrop, it was the nucleus. It's important to note that none of this relied on official titles. In fact, much of everyday matriarchy existed precisely because it wasn't codified. It filled the gaps where law and policy didn't reach. These women didn't rule by decree, they ruled by presence, by memory, and by deeply embedded responsibility. Childering, too, has long been an act of soft governance. Before the rise of parenting manuals, it was mothers who transmitted values, often through story, repetition, and example. A lullaby in Ghana might teach humility. A cautionary tale in Norway might emphasize honesty. These weren't just ways to quiet a restless child, they were tools for shaping the next generation of citizens. And then there's caretaking, the intergenerational kind, the tending of elders, the raising of grandchildren, the steady hand that balances medicine bundles with memories and mourning rituals. In many cultures, this role falls squarely into the laps of women, not because they are biologically predisposed to it, but because cultural norms have long assumed they would catch what others might drop. It's worth pausing here, not to romanticize the weight of this labor, but to recognize it. Power is often imagined as something loud, visible, or transactional. But in the domestic sphere, it's something different. It's the power to shape how a child sees the world, to decide what gets remembered and what quietly disappears, to set the rhythm of the day and often the moral compass of a family. Everyday matriarchy doesn't demand to be acknowledged, but it deserves to be. It is the foundation many formal systems of leadership are quietly built upon. And while it may not come with statues or holidays, its impact echoes through generations. If the home is where matriarchy is most often felt, then culture is where it leaves its trace, not always loudly, not in manifestos or flags, but in names passed down, in land that stays with daughters, in customs quietly carried on through the maternal line. Before laws were codified into global systems largely influenced by European colonial powers, many cultures structured identity, inheritance, and even governance around women, sometimes not out of ideology, but simply because it worked. In West Sumatra, Indonesia, the Minangkabau people are often cited as the world's largest matrilineal society. Here, lineage is traced through the mother. Land is inherited by daughters. Traditional houses, large wooden structures with soaring, buffalo horn-shaped roofs, belong to the women of the family. When a Minangkabau man marries, he moves into his wife's household, not the other way around. This isn't ceremonial, it's functional. A social structure rooted not in female domination, but in balance and continuity. The Mosuo of southern China offer another compelling window into matrilineal customs. Sometimes dubbed the Kingdom of Women, a name more poetic than practical, the Mosuo organize their families around mothers, aunts, and grandmothers. Property is passed down from mother to daughter. Children take their mother's surname. Men play important roles, often as uncles, brothers, or romantic partners, but they do not lead the household. Perhaps most intriguing is their practice of walking marriages, romantic partnerships that do not require cohabitation or shared ownership. Instead, relationships are maintained through mutual choice, without binding legal or economic contracts. This isn't lawless, it's just a different logic. In Ghana, the Akan people have long practiced a matrilineal system that shapes both familial and political life. The Queen Mother, or Ahema, is not a mere ceremonial figure. She advises the chief, nominates successors, and represents the spiritual and social wisdom of the lineage. In Akan society, the Abusua, the extended family, is traced through the mother's line. Inheritance, status, and social obligations follow that path as well. A child belongs first to their mother's clan, even if the father is a chief or a priest. This doesn't erase fatherhood, it contextualizes it within a broader maternal framework. In these cultures, matriarchy isn't about matron saints or mother goddesses. It's about laws, about names, about the everyday rituals that determine who belongs to whom and who inherits what. While patriarchy often claims universality, framing itself as the default, these societies quietly remind us that the maternal line has long carried just as much authority. In indigenous cultures of the Americas, matrilineal traditions shaped more than just family units. They influenced land use, decision-making, and identity. Among the Hopi of the American Southwest, clans are passed down through the mother, and women traditionally owned the land and homes. Marriage meant moving into the woman's family dwelling. Children were raised within her clan. This was not simply women's work or men's work divided into tasks. It was a worldview, a map of belonging drawn with maternal ink. Even in societies that were not fully matrilineal, women's legal and cultural roles were often more substantial than Western history textbooks would have us believe. In pre-colonial parts of Nigeria, for example, women were traders, judges, and community leaders, managing their own economic networks and passing skills down through female apprenticeships. While colonial systems later imposed patriarchal legal frameworks, the cultural memory of female authority remains strong in many of these regions. It's important to note that these matrilineal customs didn't always mean women held all the power. They didn't necessarily hold public office or lead armies. But they often determined lineage, property, and legacy, the building blocks of any society. And they did so not by challenging men, but by anchoring communities through continuity, tradition, and the maternal line. Today, many of these systems are in flux. Globalization, modernization, and colonial legacies have disrupted matrilineal traditions. Property laws now lean toward individual ownership. Family names increasingly follow the father. But in places like West Sumatra, Yunnan, and parts of West Africa, the old patterns still echo. a name carried through the mother's line, a house that always returns to the daughter, a grandmother whose word holds more weight than any document. What we find in these cultural and legal expressions of matriarchy is not utopia, but possibility, a reminder that power doesn't always have to arrive in the shape of a throne. Sometimes it's written into the roof beams of a home or encoded in the family name whispered into a newborn's ear. While many cultures tucked their power structures into the pockets of the home, others brought feminine leadership into the full light of public life. These were not always matriarchies in the strict academic sense, but they bent the rules enough to suggest that governance didn't need to be draped in robes and testosterone to be effective. Let's begin where the Nile narrows and history grows bold, in the ancient kingdom of Kush. South of Egypt, in present-day Sudan, rose a civilization that rivaled its northern neighbor, not just in wealth and power, but in its reverence for female leadership. The Kandakes or Candaces were royal women who ruled in their own right, not as placeholders or regents. One such queen, Amanirenas, famously faced down the Roman Empire. When Augustus sent forces to conquer Nubian lands, she responded with military might, burned Roman forts to the ground, and marched home with a bronze statue of Augustus. His head was buried beneath a temple threshold, destined to be trodden underfoot for generations, not out of petty vengeance, but as a reminder that no empire is invincible and no woman easily dismissed. But governing didn't always mean warfare or palaces. In many indigenous cultures, leadership looked less like a vertical power structure and more like a circle of interdependence. Among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois, clan mothers held real and institutional power. These elder women selected the male chiefs, and just as crucially, they could remove them. They advised on matters of war, peace, and community well-being. Their decisions shaped policy not from behind the scenes, but from within the system. Theirs was a voice carried with the wind and echoed in council fires. Travel a bit farther west to the Akan of Ghana, and you'll find the enduring role of the Queen Mother, a spiritual and political counterbalance to the male chief. She was not his wife, but his equal in many domains. While the chief might preside over external affairs, the Queen Mother preserved the lineage, served as guardian of moral authority, and ensured that leadership remained rooted in ancestral values. She was often the one who nominated the next chief, a reminder that legitimacy starts not with a crown, but with continuity. In these societies, power was not hoarded, it was circulated, not always equally, but more deliberately. Leadership was intergenerational, consensus-based, and often ceremonial in ways that didn't dilute its strength. Spiritual leaders were often women, two priestesses who read the stars, interpreted dreams, or presided over rites that tied the community to land, sky, and story. These systems didn't see power as something to be seized or clutched, but something to be held lightly and passed with care. And while they were not perfect, no society as they offered models of leadership rooted in reciprocity, not domination. It's tempting to romanticize these examples, to view them as golden eras of feminine leadership before the world turned to thrones and titles, but they were not perfect systems. They had flaws, hierarchies, and human failings. What makes them worth remembering is not their purity, but their presence evidence that female-centered governance did and does exist. It may not have always come with crowns or armies, but it came with wisdom, balance, and the long memory of those who carry stories forward. So as we trace these arcs of history, we're not looking to replace patriarchs with matriarchs in some grand game of musical chairs. We're asking a quieter question. What happens when leadership listens, when it remembers, when it roots itself in the rhythms of everyday life? And what if that kind of power the circle, not the scepter, was not a footnote, but a foundation? The structures of the past, while powerful in their own right, don't always echo cleanly into the present. Yet echoes do remain softened by time, reshaped by modern demands, and sometimes stretched thin under new burdens. If traditional matriarchies shaped the bones of a culture, today's feminine influence often works in the soft tissue, less formal, less celebrated, but just as vital. To understand what matriarchy looks like now, we shift our gaze from the past into the present, where women around the world continue to lead, sometimes visibly, often invisibly, in the rhythm and reality of daily life. She doesn't wear a crown, there's no staff in her hand, no official decree. But she knows when the milk expires, who's allergic to strawberries, and what mood each family member is in by the way they close the door. This is the quiet CEO of the modern household, a role played by millions of women across the globe, often without title, paycheck, or proper thanks. In many ways, the everyday matriarch never left. She simply adapted. Across cultures, it's women who often set the emotional thermostat of the home. They carry the weight of birthdays remembered, doctor's appointments scheduled, school forms signed, and dinners somehow made to appear nightly, as if by magic. In practice, this domestic power can look like authority. In reality, it's a finely tuned blend of responsibility, intuition, and endurance. And while her labor isn't always visible from the outside, its effects ripple through generations. In Latin America, this household matriarchy is sometimes wrapped in warmth and strength, like an abuelita who rules from the kitchen table not with dominance, but with devotion. She knows every grandchild's favorite meal, but also which cousin isn't speaking to whom and how to broker peace. In many extended families, especially in rural regions, it is these older women who manage the unspoken logistics of life, where everyone sleeps, how money gets stretched, who needs a quiet word or a firm one. Their influence is woven into the air, like the scent of simmering rice and beans, nourishing, grounding, often taken for granted. Southern Europe holds similar rhythms. In Italy, the nonna is less an archetype than a civic institution. She presides over the family calendar, the Sunday sauce, and the collective conscience. Respect for her is baked into cultural expectation, not just because of her age, but because of her accumulated wisdom, her subtle power to shape decisions with a raised eyebrow or a perfectly timed silence. In Greece and Spain, matriarchs often outlive their husbands and continue to direct the family's course well into their 80s or 90s, sometimes out of tradition, sometimes out of sheer necessity. In African American communities, the modern matriarch's role is especially pronounced. Centuries of forced separation, economic disenfranchisement, and systemic inequality created a space not of choice, but of need, where women stepped in to lead households, raise kin, and create networks of support. The big mama figure is not a cliche, she's a cornerstone. Often simultaneously, caregiver, financial manager, disciplinarian, and emotional anchor, she holds together the threads that might otherwise fray under pressure. Today, many Black families still rely on this intergenerational leadership, where grandmothers and aunties quietly manage everything from Sunday dinners to childcare to family emergencies, while often maintaining jobs and community roles. Yet despite the centrality of women in so many homes, their labor, especially emotional labor, remains largely invisible. They are the family archivists, remembering which cousin can't eat gluten, which neighbor lost a parent, which child has a test on Thursday. They mediate tensions, soothe hurt feelings, and absorb the daily microfractures of life. If traditional power was seated in the town hall, this power is dispersed through whispered reassurances and midnight worry. It is leadership, but without ceremony. It's worth noting that this domestic leadership exists across class, but the pressures vary. A wealthy mother might hire help, but still bear the full weight of managing it. The schedules, the emotional needs, the expectations. A working-class woman may be doing all of it herself, running on little sleep and constant improvisation. In both cases, the matriarchal role is alive, and it's exhausting. What differs is visibility and support. And in today's world, visibility is complicated. Social media, for example, often elevates a curated version of domestic power, the momfluencer, with matching linen sets and chore charts, while the actual backbone work of household survival goes unseen. Real matriarchy isn't always Instagrammable. It's messy, sacred, sometimes thankless, and yet still quietly shaping the world. Of course, not all women play this role. Some homes divide labor equally, some reverse it entirely, but the patterns remain prevalent. Across continents and cultures, a disproportionate share of organizing, caring, and maintaining falls to women. The mantle of matriarchy may not always be chosen, but it's often worn. As we move forward, the question isn't whether this domestic leadership exists, it's how we value it. Do we see it as power, as legacy, or merely as duty? Because if history teaches us anything, it's this: those who set the rhythm of the household often shape the rhythm of society. Legal systems are often the last to catch up to cultural reality, and the slowest to let go of their old allegiances. While many homes have long functioned under soft matriarchies, the law has traditionally been more loyal to patriarchy. Still, the story is shifting. Let's start with names. In many Western cultures, surnames have followed a father's line for generations, a default so deeply baked into bureaucracy that challenging it feels like trying to rearrange the alphabet. At birth, a child typically inherits the father's surname. Upon marriage, the woman is still more likely to change her name than the man. And while some families opt for hyphenation or blending, these remain exceptions rather than norms. Yet, change is happening. In Spain and many Latin American countries, a child receives both parents' surnames, a gesture toward balance, even if the father's name often still comes first. Iceland has long taken a different route. Children inherit patronymic or matronymic surnames, like Johnsdóttir or Johnson, literally daughter of John or son of John. The naming reflects lineage without assuming which parent is primary. These shifts in naming tell a quiet story about cultural power, about who we trace and why. When a lineage is recorded through a woman's name, it subtly affirms her place in legacy, in memory, in the map of the future. It may seem small. It isn't. Inheritance laws, too, have undergone deep transformation, but not universally and not evenly. In the past, property and wealth overwhelmingly passed from father to son. Daughters might receive a dowry, a gesture more transactional than empowering. Land, titles, businesses, these followed the male line, often under the assumption that men would manage them more capably or preserve family honor. Today, in many countries, inheritance laws are gender neutral, at least on paper. Women can inherit equally. They can pass property to their children. They can write wills, open accounts, buy land, but culture doesn't always yield as gracefully as the law does. In some parts of rural South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, customary traditions still pressure families to sidestep daughters in inheritance, despite formal legal protections. A woman may have the right to own land, but not the social power to claim it. Legal reform is essential, but enforcement, awareness, and cultural change are the quieter gears that must turn alongside it. Child custody laws offer another window into evolving gender norms. Historically, custody defaulted to the father, especially in upper-class circles, where children were seen as heirs, not dependents. In the 19th century, the tide shifted toward maternal custody, based on the notion that young children belonged with their mothers. That too was a gendered assumption, softer, but still limiting. Today, many countries favor joint custody as the ideal, recognizing both parents as essential. But court decisions still often tilt toward mothers, not always due to bias, but because women are more likely to have been the primary caregivers. The cultural assumption that caregiving is women's work continues to shape outcomes, and that assumption, even when well-intentioned, reinforces a cycle of expectation. Meanwhile, in LGBTQ+ families, legal definitions of parenthood are still catching up. Two mothers or two fathers navigating custody, adoption, or parental rights may face legal systems that were never built with their families in mind. Their struggles reveal a broader truth. Laws don't just govern, they reflect what a society imagines as possible. And then there's the issue of unpaid labor, the invisible economy of caregiving, emotional management, and domestic organization that women disproportionately carry. This isn't usually addressed in legal code, but it underpins every conversation about equity and recognition. When courts divide assets in a divorce, for instance, how do they value the years a partner spent raising children, supporting a spouse's career, or managing the family's day-to-day life? In some countries, notably Sweden, Iceland, and parts of Canada, there are attempts to legislate more generous parental leave and subsidize childcare, recognizing that caregiving is economic labor. But in much of the world, these tasks are still seen as private responsibility, not public contribution. What we choose to enshrine in law and what we leave to tradition reveals our priorities. It shows who we believe deserves protection, recognition, and autonomy. So what does all this mean for the idea of matriarchy? It means that while matrilineal structures have existed for centuries, and soft household matriarchies have quietly ruled dinner tables and family calendars, the formal recognition of feminine power is still catching up. Culture is flexible, law is slow, and legacy, that deepest current, can take generations to reroute. But reroute it does. Today, more women are keeping their names. More are passing on property. More children carry maternal surnames or are raised in homes where love, not gender, defines the shape of leadership. These are not revolutions with banners and fanfare. They are changes in ink, in habit, in whispered conversations that slowly shape a new story. And perhaps the most powerful shifts aren't legal at all, they're emotional. They live in the stories families tell, the photos passed down, the traditions kept alive, not out of obligation, but love. That is its own kind of law, one that writes us, even as we write it. If formal leadership is the most visible form of power, it's also the most stubborn to shift. For centuries, the halls of governance, whether parliaments or palaces, were designed by and for men. Even when women entered the room, they often had to sit in chairs that didn't quite fit, speaking a language of authority that wasn't written with their voices in mind. But the architecture is slowly changing. Around the world, more women are stepping into leadership roles: presidents, prime ministers, mayors, judges. As of today, more than 60 countries have had female heads of state or government. But while these headlines signal progress, the deeper story lies in how leadership is being reimagined, not just who holds power, but how they choose to hold it. Take Jacinda Ardern, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Her leadership during crises from the Christchurch mosque shootings to the COVID-19 pandemic was praised not just for decisiveness, but for empathy. She governed with clarity, but also with a visible humanity. She made space for grief, not just grit. And while she didn't claim to lead as a female leader, her style quietly offered an alternative to more adversarial forms of governance. In Rwanda, women hold over 60% of the seats in parliament, the highest in the world. This wasn't accidental. After the 1994 genocide, Rwanda rewrote its constitution, and actively prioritize gender equity in government. The result? A system that integrates women into national decision-making at every level. It isn't a utopia, but it is a model of deliberate change rather than token inclusion. And then there are quieter examples: local council women in rural India advocating for sanitation and education, female judges in Afghanistan navigating impossible decisions, Indigenous women in Canada leading land and water protection efforts in the face of extractive industries. These aren't just stories of representation, they are stories of redefinition. Still, the presence of women in leadership doesn't always mean the presence of matriarchal values. Some women rise by mastering the existing system, sometimes at the cost of soft power or community-rooted ways of leading. They play by the rules because changing the rules would cost them their place. It's not a betrayal, it's a survival strategy. But beyond politics, leadership is showing up in new forms. In community organizing, mutual aid networks, and social movements, women, particularly women of color, are often the backbone. Think of the Black women who mobilized voters across the U.S. South, or Indigenous women leading environmental justice movements. These women don't always carry titles, but they carry the community. In traditional cultures where feminine authority has long been acknowledged, this leadership continues. In Ghana, Queen Mothers remain essential to community governance, offering wisdom and spiritual stewardship. In the Navajo Nation, grandmothers and aunties still play pivotal roles in decision-making, passing down teachings that are moral compass and survival guide rolled into one. Spiritual leadership also deserves mention. In many Buddhist, Hindu, and indigenous traditions, women lead not through institutional hierarchy, but through lineage, ritual, and embodied wisdom. The matriarch of a temple, the elder who guides ceremonies, the medicine woman who reads the land all, are stewards of a different kind of authority. In the modern workplace, a similar shift is emerging slowly, but noticeable. More organizations are recognizing that leadership doesn't have to mean domination. Emotional intelligence, collaboration, and empathy are gaining currency. It's not that women are inherently better at these things. It's that, for too long, leadership excluded them. Now, other models are being allowed into the room. But structural barriers remain. Women are still underrepresented in the highest levels of business, politics, and religious institutions. The glass ceiling hasn't vanished, it's just been better decorated. And even when women lead, they often do so with fewer resources, more scrutiny, and an ever-present balancing act between strong and likable. Which brings us to the question, what does matriarchal leadership look like today? So, if matriarchy doesn't mean simply flipping the script, if it isn't about replacing kings with queens or iron fists with softer ones, what does it look like in motion? Maybe it starts small. Not with a sweeping theory or a grand vision, but with daily choices, quiet adjustments, questions asked gently, a different way of listening, deciding, honoring. If power is to be reshaped, not just rebranded, it begins here, in kitchens and classrooms, in boardrooms and bedtime stories, in the ways we relate, remember, and rebuild together. These steps aren't commandments, they're invitations. Maybe we can rethink the family name. We can start by examining the simple, inherited assumptions, like why a child almost always carries the father's name. It's a tradition so entrenched, we forget it's a choice. Asking the question doesn't mean dismantling the family. It means recognizing that legacy can come from both parents and that a name carries weight, memory, and meaning. What might it mean to offer our children the lineage of their mothers as well as their fathers? What if naming became a conversation, not a foregone conclusion? Maybe we can make caregiving visible and valued. Unpaid caregiving is often treated like background noise in a busy world, but it's the heartbeat of any functioning society. Raising children, tending to elders, building community, all of it requires time, patience, and emotional labor, yet we rarely count it as work. Recognizing this labor, naming it, and compensating it socially, economically, emotionally, would shift more than just statistics. It would shift the entire value system we live inside. Maybe we should redefine leadership to include listening. Leadership is too often defined by who speaks loudest, not who listens best. But matriarchal systems across time have shown us another way, where leadership is about discernment, intuition, and collective well-being. We can model a different kind of power for the next generation. One who understands silence isn't absence, and that soft voices often carry the deepest truths. Maybe we should balance labor in the household. It's one thing to divide chores, it's another to share responsibility. Emotional labor, mental load, scheduling, remembering, these are not small tasks. They shape the rhythm of a household, and too often, they're invisible. When partners acknowledge and redistribute this load, something shifts. The home becomes not just a place of duty, but a space of shared stewardship. Maybe we can update rituals and traditions thoughtfully. From holiday routines to family rules, many of our cultural rituals were designed in a different time for a different shape of family. We don't have to throw them out, but we can examine them. Who benefits? Who bends? Updating our rituals to reflect mutual respect, shared values, and diverse experiences doesn't erase heritage, it deepens it. Maybe we could make an effort to bring feminine wisdom into public life. The boardroom and the kitchen table are not so different. Both require foresight, diplomacy, and flexibility. Integrating traditionally feminine ways of knowing, intuition, emotional intelligence, a cyclical view of time into civic business and leadership structures isn't about replacing one lens with another. It's about seeing more clearly by looking through both. Maybe we should elevate elders as cultural guides. In many matriarchal societies, elder women aren't marginalized. They are honored as cultural stewards and decision makers. Reclaiming this role, especially in Western cultures that prize youth, can be revolutionary. Wisdom doesn't retire, it ripens. And when we seek the voices of those who've seen generations rise and fall, we strengthen the bridge between past and future. And maybe we should normalize shared governance at every level. From families to governments, shared governance isn't chaos, it's a return to balance. We can normalize decision-making that includes multiple perspectives, especially across genders. That means bringing more women into leadership, but also reshaping what leadership looks like. A council, not a throne, a circle, not a chain of command. So, where does all this leave us? After walking through centuries of quiet leadership and legal legacy, of invisible labor and resilient governance, we arrive not at a battle cry, but at a quiet question. What might leadership look like if we stopped modeling it on the throne? Not a matriarchy that mimics patriarchy, but one that invites something gentler, wiser, and more enduring. What if power wasn't about who gets to sit at the head of the table, but about how that table is shaped and how many seats it holds? In many ways, the matriarchal ideal isn't new at all. Shared governance, especially the kind shaped by feminine values, has been quietly alive in cultures around the world. It's been preserved in grandmother councils, in elder aunties who speak last and are listened to most, in women who steward land, memory, medicine, and meaning. This isn't an invitation to simply switch out patriarchs for matriarchs and keep the same scaffolding in place. That's not evolution, it's a costume change. Real change asks us to imagine a different architecture altogether, not a pyramid of power, but a circle. A space where leadership is shared, wisdom is honored, and decisions are made through conversation rather than command. Even in contemporary spaces, we're beginning to see echoes of this return. In workplaces that prioritize emotional intelligence and collaboration, in grassroots movements organized horizontally rather than top-down, in community groups, mutual aid networks, and even families, where the people who hold it all together aren't always the loudest, but they're the ones who bring everyone back to center. Feminine leadership, in its most authentic form, doesn't compete with masculine leadership. It complements it. It reminds us that power doesn't have to dominate to be effective. That strength can be flexible. That authority can be nurturing. That guidance can come from listening, not just speaking. None of this is about idealizing women or burdening them with the expectation to fix a world they didn't break alone. Nor is it about excluding men. It's about balance. About recognizing that many of our current models, political, corporate, familial, are built on imbalance, and that the antidote may not be more power in the same shape, but power in a new shape entirely. Maybe the future of leadership isn't a pendulum swing. Maybe it's not a contest at all. Maybe it's a gathering. Maybe it's a table, low to the ground, surrounded by elders, newcomers, listeners, and leaders alike. No podium, no scepter. Just a circle where power is held with care, not clenched in fists. Because perhaps the most radical reimagining of matriarchy isn't about replacing power over with power under. It's about cultivating power with. The kind of power that mends rather than mocks, that restores rather than rules. And in a world that's grown tired of dominance masquerading as strength, maybe that's exactly the kind of leadership we're quietly craving. Maybe we're not inventing a new way forward. Maybe we're remembering it. Good night.